Welcome to another episode of Appalachian Shine. This is JC Swangruber, your usual host. And today we're really grateful to have Kate Brandis on with us. Now, Kate is an author with one book out on Amazon and the bookstores now. She has another book coming out soon. Kate, you have a really interesting way of telling a story, and you have a really interesting history according to your bio. I wanted to talk a little bit about that. First of all, tell us where you're at and what you do now besides writing.
Sure. Yeah, well, thanks for having me. And I I work as I'm a scientist. That's my background. So I actually teach geology at a little university in Eastern Pennsylvania, Moravian University. And I do a couple other things there. I occasionally teach creative writing, but my primary job is to teach geology. So that's what I do kind of to make money,
So
more or
you live in
less.
is it Riegelsville? Did I pronounce that correctly?
It's Regal Hills is what it's
Riegelsville,
called. Yeah.
Pennsylvania. Okay. Now it's a
Yeah.
small town, and I assume that's near Bethlehem, where the university is. And it
Yeah.
says here that that you write about rural places and with these interesting small town dynamics. And after reading a little bit about your first book, I'll say you write some interesting small town dynamics. A really great background to that story. But I'm kind of curious, as worked as a geologist and environmental scientist for a long time. Tell us a little bit about how you got involved in that, and then how in the world did you transition to writing books?
Yeah, good question. So I grew up actually for most of my early adulthood uh in sort of central Pennsylvania in the mountains, a very rural area. And very small school. I graduated with 80 people. And for some reason, even though I had an earth science class in high school, I think in eighth grade, and for some reason I had the idea that I wanted to be a geologist, even when I was back in high school, and I didn't even know what that meant. And it just was in my head, and that's what I wanted to do. And when I went away to go to college, that I just never strayed from that for whatever reason. I was always interested. And part of my interest, I think, was that if you're a geologist, you get to go outside a lot, and you get to go on, these trips and go out in nature. And I've always been a lover. I feel most at home kind of out in nature. And I just was so fascinated by kind of the story of the land. And that's how I always thought about geology, is it's really like, if you're a geologist, you look at layers of the rock, and each layer of the rock is kind of like a page in the book. That's kind of what I tell my students these days. And it's really true that every layer kind of tells you a little bit about the history of the earth. And so to me, even back before I even got interested in creative writing, I was interested in geology because to me, it would told a story. And so I, got a job after school as a geologist and worked in that field as a geologist, and then as an environmental scientist well, I'm still doing that work. So I mean, I'm 52 now, so it's been 30 years or so that I've been working in that. Um, how did I become a writer? I was always a reader. I always read fiction. And even though I'm a scientist, and maybe, I would have been better if I would be reading nonfiction, I love fiction. And I've always been a reader from early on. And I understood and understand things about my world and life really through those stories, through fiction. And so for whatever reason, I had my first, I have two sons, and I had my first son when I was right around 35. And I there's some correlation between my desire to write and the birth of my first child. I can't explain it to myself really, but I got interested in trying to tell a story at that point. And so that's when I just decided I was going to teach myself to do creative writing. And that's what I did. I started with a short story that took me, a year to perfect. And it probably wasn't very good even when I perfected it over a year. And then I spent the next 10 years writing my first novel, and learning to write. Really, I learned by doing. So that's the story, more or less,
Yeah,
in a nutshell.
yeah. I mean, writing takes takes time. I started writing back in 2000, and it took me probably 18 years to get my first book the way I wanted it. In the meantime, I've written many more, but to go back and correct that first one, it's like, wow, why was it? But the way you described looking at the layers of the earth like a story, and every page is like that. That really sort of makes sense when it comes to looking at small town rural areas, especially central Pennsylvania, or even western Pennsylvania, and the other places where you've lived. That you know, it's the people have just as dynamic a story as they sort of cling to the land and cling to the mountains in a way too, generation after generation after generation. And that is a really good way of describing that. Now you lived, I read where you lived at in Louisiana, right? New Orleans, and then in Tennessee too. How did living in those areas impact maybe the future of your storytelling or the way you approach this craft?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, when I was very young, I lived a lot of different places kind of in the Southeast. I was born in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and then I moved to New Orleans, and then I moved to Madison, Tennessee, which is nearish Nashville, then lived for a while in Youngstown, Ohio before I landed in central Pennsylvania, which is where my mother is from and where her parents are from, and et cetera. So that we've got deep roots there in the mountains of central Pennsylvania. And in my early life, a lot of those first homes, like in New Orleans and in Tennessee, were actually in urban areas, and kind of not the nicest, probably were urban areas. But I was always, as a child, the back in those days, like kids ran free, and I did too. And even as a child, I would go out and find, like the ditch or like the rock wall with like the vines crawling over it. I was looking for nature even back then. I mean, that's where I would play. I would go out and find like the abandoned lot, and look at the plants and see things like that. And when my family did move to central Pennsylvania, we moved to a small rural wooded area, and I felt kind of at home and kind of at
Yeah,
peace in some ways,
yeah, that had to
in
be
a
like
way that
heaven. Yeah,
kind of was, yeah. But I mean, and I think a lot of people who feel like they love nature maybe had their early experiences with that. And, I would say that I didn't. I was really in like this urban landscape for the most part, but still sought out those natural things. Um, and I think, my family again has those deep roots in central Pennsylvania. My grandfather, was a farmer, and lots of farming history in my family. And this idea of seeing the land, kind of be the interdependence between land and people, and the history of that, kind of in my family, and where I was, mostly based then in central Pennsylvania. That's the way people and the land work together, like they depend on each other in a lot of ways. And so I think that influenced not only my interest in geology, but also in the stories I tell, because I somehow I really identify with that idea.
yeah. It's just interesting. Just on the side, when I was young, when I was in high school, wasn't sure what I wanted to be when I grew up. I got invited to governor's school here in Virginia, in southwestern Virginia, and the only course they had open left of the four subjects was geology. So I went
Mhm.
into I went into that, and that was probably one of the best summers I've ever had. I learned so much. And you talk about these layers. The thing that's fascinating when you go out, growing up around here, you're just used to nature. You don't really pay that much attention to it. But you were in the city, so you were
Yeah.
looking for it. And then when you got there, it's like, wow, this is bliss, right? And then,
Yeah.
but I didn't realize what was underneath our feet. I knew growing up, I had family that worked in the coal mines. My father had worked in the mines when I was yet very small, and before he got hurt. And then um, we were on the roadside just chiseling away at some rock, and
Mhm.
said, just see what you see in the rock. The guy's name was Craig Ashbrook. I still remember this guy to this day. And when I chiseled a piece of rock that fell, it's a nice sized chunk, and I pick it up and I look at it, and I see something that just blew my mind away. It's like, wow, the ocean was here. because
Yeah.
inside that rock there was a fossil that, it looked like a snail to me with all the ridges. And I really, to this day, I couldn't. He told me what it was, but I forgot. But I looked at it, I was
Mhm.
like, wow, there was a sea creature, some little sea animal that was living in here, that was here right under our feet. So I gave that to the college to use in their display there. They still have it up. And I
Oh,
thought
very good.
how fascinating. And so I understand that fascination. I almost went into geology when I was young.
Mhm.
Instead, I opted for economics, which I would have probably had more fun playing in the rocks and in the grass. But it's a really a fascinating thing, and I want to talk a little bit about your first book because you can see how your passion for nature really found its way in your first book, and The Promise of Pearson Orchard. And this came out what about
Mhm.
2017? I think it was.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's right.
so talk about a family dynamic and really a dramatic story. Um, I was reading the jacket on this, and this is really incredible. I don't want to give too much away with the book, so could you tell us a little bit about the book? This is going to be my next read, actually.
Okay.
Tell us a little bit about the book and what inspired this particular story.
Sure. Yeah. So that book is a family drama, and at the center of the family drama is fracking, which I don't know that everyone will know that term, but it's natural gas drilling, in which a sort of a technique in where you drill very, very far into the ground and fracture the rock with explosives really deep, deep down, and it releases the natural gas, which travels up a well, and you can gather the gas and sell it. And so this fracking was when I was writing, just before I was writing that book, like in the years prior, it was a lot happening in Pennsylvania and sort of, the surrounding area. A lot of talk about it. It was a new technique at the time for being able to capture natural gas. And I was living in like the Bethlehem area, sort of eastern Pennsylvania at the time, where there was no natural gas. And so I was also working as an environmental scientist, and my job at that time was to kind of talk to people locally about different environmental topics. And people locally in this area of eastern Pennsylvania, where there's no natural gas, were very against the whole idea. And it struck me, as I said, I have family in central Pennsylvania who at the very same time were leasing their land for gas drilling, with this idea and history of, they I do have coal mining in my family and farming, and we're, again, this history of like the land and people are interdependent, and there's a relationship there. And my family in central Pennsylvania, this was a way of making money, that they kind of needed. So that was, the other storyline. And so here in eastern Pennsylvania, where people didn't have that opportunity, like the opportunity was not presented. It was just they were just making a judgment about whether this was right or wrong. There were two different things that were happening there. One conversation over here in eastern Pennsylvania where people were just like, this is terrible. And then, conversation with my own family in central Pennsylvania where this was something that was practical for them to be doing. And I can understand both sides totally. So I wanted to write a book about it, and I wanted to write a book about it that really captured the complexity of both of those viewpoints. And so the story is told through 4 points of view, and each one of my characters has a very different feeling about natural gas drilling, which is happening in the story. So in the story, there's a gas company that comes to this fictional, very small town, and one of my main characters that operates an apple orchard, which is the promise of Pearson Orchard, the apple orchard in the town, and they want to, they're contemplating whether to lease their land for gas drilling or not. And so that's how that story was. I just wanted to examine that, I think, very complicated topic in the sort of a complicated way, because I think the answer is not very easy.
No, it's
So
not. And then the family dynamic that you wove through the story, um, I mean, it can rip a family apart. It's because
for sure.
you have one lady who's an environmental lawyer, and
Yeah,
one son working to thwart what another son's doing, thinking he's coming in to save the town, right? And
exactly.
it's so it's really I can't wait. I'm looking forward to reading it because this it sounds really like an intense family drama, and being a fan of shows like I don't know Longmire and things like that sort of reminded me of some of those dynamics in there. Um, so, how long did it take you to write that book, and when did you start? When did you kind of get the inspiration for
Well, I was inspired by like those conversations I was having, like as I was working as an environmental scientist, I just felt like all of the conversations I was hearing or reading about in all the papers, because it was big news at that time, were just not sort of very one-dimensional, not looking at the full issue, so that's what inspired me to write the book. And it took me 10 years. I didn't know, I was at the very beginning of learning to write creatively, when I started the book, so I just did it wrong, and failed over 10 years over and over. But every time I did it wrong, I figured out a little bit more of what was right. So I think I see that book as kind of teaching me to write in a lot of ways. I had a lot of readers. I had so many people, giving me pointers, some of them not good, some of them good. And, along the way, I just learned a tremendous amount. And I'm very grateful to have had that experience, and really the ability to kind of take all those years to write that book. I worked very hard on it every day. But I was happy to have that time because it really helped me. Not that writing my second book was any easier, but I did learn quite a bit from that first experience.
reading the reviews? Though you had some great reviews from the readers, so that was kind of nice to see on Amazon. Just kind of to get away from the book for a second, but get back to the topic of fracking, where you were talking about how you can sort of see both sides. Have you been involved in any kind of forums where because it is very polarizing, and you have
Mhm.
you sort of hate the world that's so far left, so far right, and all the nobody else in the middle gets heard.
Yes.
Have you had an opportunity to sort of sit in on panels and have like reasonable, rational discussions with people that sort of are on both sides of the aisle for the public to hear this?
I have not myself participated in, I've participated in maybe some panel discussions of that kind. I guess I'm thinking about it now. When that book came out, I did sit on a couple panels, um, that I was grateful to sit on because I think you're quite right. I would love for the conversation to be more, let's talk about it, because there's not an easy answer here. And there's not a right answer for everyone either. I think, it's very dependent on where you are, who you are, that kind of thing. Um, I wish there were more. Really, I think if and one of my real interests is this idea of like, let's being able to talk, everyone, being
Yeah,
able to talk about more things, and coming together rather than being so divided. I'm very, interested in that. And I tend to write about that. And in some ways, that book, The Promise of Pearson Orchard, is a lot about that. And my new book, Stone Creek, is a lot about that. It's really this idea of trying to come together. It's why I'm so really interested in small towns, and rural communities, because I think there is such a good sense of community generally amongst people. I mean, yes, we even with if we have our differences, I do think that because places are small and we have to work together to get things done, I do think there's more unity, and more conversations that are cross lines, in a rural community personally. Um, so
yeah,
yeah.
that very well may be true. Yeah, because small towns, we all sort of know each other. Yeah,
We do. We do.
so
And I
you
mean,
can only
yeah,
yeah, there's no hiding behind Facebook when you know what I mean, when you say something and
yeah.
or
And
pose an argument.
right. And I mean, of course, people have their differences and maybe, but we also, I mean, in my small town, which is, one traffic light town, we also, if something happens and our town is, we live right by a river and it floods here. And I'll tell you, when it floods and when there's a real dire situation on our hands, this town comes together. The fire hall opens, people bring food, everybody goes there. It's something to see. And that's what I love and value so much about my town and other towns like it, these small places.
Yeah, it is nice to see that and people come together. So you mentioned Stone Creek. So let's transition a little bit to this because this book comes out next month, and it's got a really interesting backstory to this too, um, with your character Tilly Stone. So without giving away too much, what can we expect from Stone Creek?
Well, just like The Promise of Pearson Orchard, which is inspired in part by my, environmental sciencey kind of background. Stone Creek is a little bit along those lines. It's in this case, it features low head dams and dam removal. But the book is told from Tilly Stone's point of view. She's sold in two timelines. So she's raised by a father who's an eco-terrorist, and he blows up dams as kind of like um, a statement against them. And Tilly is raised by him, and then he leaves her, and she kind of has to fend for herself from the age of 13. And then the second timeline is her as a young adult, like 30 years old, and her father comes back into her life and kind of threatens to upset sort of this very fragile life that she's created in this small town. So that's the sort of story. So it explores a little bit about um, dam removal, a little, but it's really about their relationship, this father-daughter relationship between Tilly and her father Frank.
Now, one of the reviews, I guess, advanced praise, I saw this from Kirkus Reviews, suggests shades of Delia Owens' Where the Crawdads Sing and Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird. Two amazing books. So to even have a comparison to those is fascinating. So this one has to be on your summer reading list too, if you're listening. Especially anybody that's a fan of Where the Crawdads Sing. And actually, I know a few listeners to the show who praise that book. So these are some folks that are in the Authors Guild regionally. So definitely give this one a try. It comes out on the 6th, I think, of next month. Is it
Yeah, 6th
August
of
6th?
August.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm looking forward to that too. We were talking before we started recording that that was such a powerful book and so well written.
Oh, yeah.
Um, as you learned I guess got into the writing craft and started learning and perfecting this, how was it to actually get into I guess, the details of small town life and the kind of the minutia? Was that the hardest part to sort of, I guess, to write, or was it more along the lines of explaining some of the perspectives and point of views from uh, your perspective as a scientist?
I think the small town life details are probably a bit easier for me just because it's my life. So I can just kind of write what's around me a little bit. Um, I would say writing wise, it is more of a challenge for me to represent kind of these sciencey ideas in a way that doesn't feel sciencey. Because up until the time I was 35, I was writing just sort of sciencey technical documents. So I was always writing, but creative writing is of course quite different. And so to understand that and to make that transition and to describe some of these things in a way that doesn't feel like that feels like a story and an interesting one, an interesting story. That took me and still I still work on that a lot. And I think I also, the relationships in my stories and things like that, that takes me a while to really to build up. And it's like a layering process for me. I will write something that will feel pretty empty. I think kind of a husk is my first draft is kind of the way I think about it. And then I'm a reviser to the maximum. And I feel like every time I go through and revise, I add a little bit more layering. Um, so yeah, that's my process. I'm a painter too, and I think about it as painting in some ways. I paint in watercolor, and I'm not very good. I'm just like totally an amateur, but When you paint watercolors, you do these layers and you can create these really amazing, complex paintings in watercolor if you're willing to sort of take time and layer and you know, not worry so much about the hard lines and try to blend things together. So I
And
think about it like that sometimes.
that's a great way to look at it because being a writer is indeed also being an artist. And every page you're painting a picture, a visual, you're painting an
Yeah.
emotion for somebody. And that's hard to like, if you're putting emotion into your painting, you're pouring emotion onto a page too. And so it's sort of in a way very similar. Yeah, to get such high accolades on this upcoming book, I did want to ask you said you were very well read and love reading fiction. Did you have any, I guess, literary icons that sort of molded the way you approach writing or that inspired you to write in the style that you do?
I love Barbara Kingsolver. I've read many of her books. Demon Copperhead is her most recent.
Great one. Yeah.
Where the Crawdads Sing, of course, I love that book. And so books that kind of dwell in nature a lot. I love. I'm a big fan of Tana French books too. She's a mystery writer. But I think she just kind of writes so well. I love to read her work. Um, and I like Kent Harif. He's a writer from the Midwest who I just think writes beautifully. So those are, I mean, I read a whole lot more than that, and I could probably keep on going, but those are the ones that kind of rise to the top of my head.
Yeah. All good authors. All good authors. And I try to read a lot of fiction and nonfiction. I probably try to read at least 20 books a year.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So I think I'm up to about 15 so far this year. Last year I hit a total of 45. I was
Wow, that's
quite
amazing.
pleased. Yeah.
Yes, that's great. I wish
That
I
was
could
one of
read.
those that was one of those crazy years where I just said, "Hey, I'm going to set this high bar," but thankfully there's Audible, and so that helped out a lot
Yes.
just to be able to do things around the house and listen to a book. But so what do you once the book comes out? Are you going to be signed doing any book signings anywhere or traveling with the book?
I'm going to do a couple book signings, but probably just locally, at least for now. I uh I teach, and so beginning in the fall, it's going to be a crazy, crazy time until next summer.
Well, yeah, yeah, it's that's full time. I have teachers in my family, and it's once fall hits, we'll see you next spring.
Yeah,
We'll see you
yeah.
sometime late spring. But I certainly thank you for stopping by. Your books are available on Amazon and Barnes and Noble, so you can get them there. There's also one listed on your website, bookshop.org. Is that a local place?
Yeah, it's an online store, but it supports local bookstores. So instead of the money going to Amazon, it goes to a local bookstores in general, wherever the closest local bookstore is that would be supplying that copy, that's where the money goes.
Okay. I did want to ask you real quick though. Do you, I guess you're open for like workshops and things like that you offer. What are the types of things that do you do there, and how can people contact you?
Well, I do have a website, katebrandis.com. So I have a contact page there. If you want to contact me, please, I'd love to hear from you. And I have offered workshops in the past. I will actually this spring or this fall be teaching creative writing at the university I teach at, but I do workshops too occasionally. Um, so yeah, reach out.
All right, so you're available for those things. Thanks again for coming on to the show today. Folks, don't forget to pick up her book next month. You can get it on Amazon or Barnes and Noble. And make sure you leave a review. Those are always helpful to authors when those books come out. So thank you so much, Kate. I appreciate you coming on to the show. We'd love to have you back sometime after the book comes out, see how things are going, and let us know what you're working on next. We'd love to um, keep keep your books out there in front of people. And also make sure you check out our website and go check out supportappalachia.org. We certainly appreciate all the support we get there. Thanks to everybody for listening to Appalachian Shine and making it actually grow very well. We've been recognized in a couple of magazines and Women's Voice magazine for for supporting local and regional authors and artists. So Thanks again, everybody, for the accolades and recommending us for all that. Certainly appreciate it. And we will see you on down the road.